Good evening, everybody. My name is Manuel Sirauki, Assistant Curator at DIA, and I want to welcome you once again to the Artist on Artist lecture series. Tonight presenting David Levine on Bruce Nauman. As many of you know, this monthly series invites artists working today to consider DIA's collection and programs with a double aim. On the one hand, to generate original insight on the works this institution has supported and accompanied for more than 40 years. And on the other, to learn more about the thinking and the practice of the artists who bravely come here to speak. For those among you who are already familiar with the work of David Levine, this invitation, as well as his choice of Bruce Nauman as a subject for this lecture, may not come as a surprise. Ever since his earliest projects, such as the almost legendary Night Motherfucker at Gavin Brown Passerby in 2004, David Levine has confronted, or should I better say, infiltrated, questions of theatricality and performance that, shifting rapidly from the artist to the spectator's side, have haunted contemporary art for the past 5 decades. In fact, Levine's early gesture of constructing a large, faux minimalist volume, operating as both stage and backstage for two actors locked in it and isolated from each other, performing rather than just reading Broadway plays ad nauseam, that gesture is not entirely unfamiliar with the activities a young Bruce Nauman staged in his own studio, also in the problematic vicinity of sculpture. Nauman was, let's say, dancing or exercising on the perimeter of a square, or bouncing two balls between the floor and ceiling with changing rhythms at his Pasadena studio around 1967. Pretty much at the same time, the critic Michael Fried famously or unfamously or infamously produced the concepts of theatricality and objecthood against the already irresistible quote-unquote ideology of minimal art. And precisely one of David Levine's most remarkable artist statements, published in 2006, is titled Bad Art and Objecthood, in which the equation good theater equal bad art equal bad theater is analyzed in an unusually lucid and crude fashion. The meaning and lack of meaning of literalism or bare life, the authentic and heartfelt inauthenticity of human action, although animals act and fake too, in regard to the ungraspable truths of our behavior, are exposed in the work of David Levine by means of misplaced theatrical conventions. And in fact, the presence of theater, the virus of theater, if we think of Antonin Artaud, threatens the shared space of art spectatorship and the artwork perhaps like no other, turning people into comedians and objects into decor and vice versa. And as Levine has indicated, turning everything into a specimen of itself, trapping the real and art and the art of the real between quotation marks. Some try to unsuccessfully escape or counter this theatrical pollution, which David Levine embraces with analytical and quasi-Baroque playfulness. And now a few straight facts. David Levine was born in New York in 1970. He grew up surrounded by art at home, but he set out to study English literature. And in the mid-1990s, he directed his first theater plays, only to realize that contemporary art offered a much more ambiguous and insincere space for his investigations. Among many important exhibitions, his work was included in Documenta 12 in Kassel, Germany, and it has been presented in such venues as the Museum of Modern Art in New York, the Massachusetts Museum of Contemporary Art, North Adams, the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard University, and the Museu Coleção Berardo in Lisbon. In 2015, he will participate in upcoming exhibitions with Creative Time in New York and Red Cat in Los Angeles. Levine is a professor of art and the director of studio and performing arts at Bard College, Berlin. He lives in New York and Berlin. And before we listen to David's lecture, I would like to acknowledge those who make this event possible. The Artist on Artist lecture series is supported in part with public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, and the drinks tonight are a courtesy of Brooklyn Brewery. I want to thank my colleagues at the Art Foundation, Yasmil Raymond, Kelly Kivland, Megan Whitco, Andriana Campbell, Jennifer Borlensky, Blair Babcock, and Max Tanone, as well as Rebecca Kleman and John Dieringer at EAI, for their help in synchronizing all elements of this program. Lastly, a very special thanks goes to David Levine for accepting our invitation and being at the Chelsea tonight. And without further ado, please join me in welcoming David Levine to DIA.
You should actually be clapping for Manuel for that introduction. And thank you to DIA and everyone at DIA for having me and for sourcing all the stuff I asked them to source, and for generally for inviting me to do this and being so supportive. Somebody said, I think it was Andrew Solomon, that you could always recognize a Nauman piece by the way it made you want to leave the room immediately. And I didn't quite understand how true that was until I tried to get to work on talking about his work in some depth. And now, especially, I would love to leave the room immediately. But I'm not. However, his work, well, like all work, when you look at it too closely, is extremely hard to pin down. And the more you talk about it, the more confused you get. So this talk may be a mixture of coherence and complete babble in a way that Nauman might actually appreciate. But without further ado, so as Manuel said, I started out as a theater director, and from 1998 to about 2004, I worked in professional theater in New York, doing plays at both commercial theaters uptown and more experimental venues downtown. So by the time I first visited Berlin in 2004, I was really, really, really frustrated, because the experimental theaters, as you can perhaps tell from image 3, were too broke to do anything spectacular, and the commercial theaters were so invested in some kind of spectacle that they couldn't really afford to experiment, either with audiences or performance styles or anything else. So I felt extremely boxed in, hemmed in, just bouncing between these two poles, sort of forced to do the same thing over and over and over again. And then in Berlin, while just museum hopping, I happened upon this exhibition at the Deutsche Guggenheim. It's curated by Susan Cross about a month before it closed. And prior to that, I wasn't really very familiar with Nauman's work at all. And normally at that point, I would kind of bristle when I saw the term theater invoked in the art world, because it was always invoked dismissively, as in Fried or Burden or any number of other people, or superficially, as in Fried or Burden or other people, or both. But in this case, the title seemed perfectly appropriate. Nauman and Susan Cross, the curator, seemed to have captured something integral, not only about my experience of theater, but what theater that actually was an experience could actually be. One piece that sort of grabbed me and didn't let me go was Bouncing in the Corner, number 1, in which Nauman did just that. You turn up a little. He does this for an hour. It's It's one of the early studio pieces from 1968. It's actually can be quite loud once you really gets going. And this bouncing kind of crystallized my experience of making theater. I just kept doing the same stupid thing over and over again, so anonymously. And you'll note that in a lot of works, Nauman makes sure his head is either cut off or isolated. You did this staging so anonymously that no one can even identify you. And that incessant slam kind of expressed the nullity of the experience as well as the frustration it provoked. You just kept banging into that corner over and over again. The other piece that really struck me was the performance corridor from 1969, which was a simple structure of two walls spaced about 20 inches apart. And as a museum visitor, you either walk in or you don't. And that's about it. It's about, I think, 20 feet long. The space is just tight enough to constrain and control your movements a little bit, which is pretty much exactly what Nauman built the corridor. Whoa. To do. He'd built it a year previous to shoot the studio video Walk with Contrapposto in 1968, in which, over the course of, again, an hour, he walks in this exaggerated Renaissance posture up and down the hallway. And while researching this, I actually came across a lot of Nauman remixes and remakes, which is, I guess, to be expected, but I got to see James Franco putting on makeup in the studio, and I got to see a woman kind of voguing her way in very intense HD up and down a mirrored corridor. I don't think she did the full hour, I think she just looped it. Anyway, for the Whitney's 1969 show, a year after he shot this, this anti-illusion show, Nauman opted to exhibit just the corridor itself. And the performance corridor is often viewed as a turning point in his practice, where he shifted the subject of his physical experiments from himself to his audience. Nauman himself says that he hadn't previously allowed audiences to get involved in his work because he couldn't figure out how to control the situation. It wasn't one of these Robert Morris, you can pick up pieces and play with it kind of things. He was very serious about this, and until he figured out how to control the audience, no one was getting involved. But here, with the performance corridor, he began to figure it out, although he would later say, as he started making corridor after corridor after corridor, that he sort of rejected this piece because it didn't allow him enough control over people's experience. But I just saw this piece, and I didn't know about the rest of them. And just as I read the bouncing in the corner piece as a kind of very bleak but familiar read on making art, I kind of read the structure as an equally bleak expression of the limitations on what performers and audiences could actually experience. There was something about the way Nauman's work expressed both rage and constraint. Rage as the result of limits, and limits as a way of reining in rage, that really stayed with me when I left Berlin. But it also pointed the way towards making work out of frustration with those limits, or making work about frustration with those limits. So when, a few months later, by a more or less total accident that Lynn Sullivan will be familiar with, I wound up getting invited to spend a week at Gavin Brown's old space, Passerby, and to make a piece there. And all of the Nauman influence just came roiling out. I built a big minimalist sculpture out of MDF, and I locked 2 professional actors inside, as Manuel said. And there was a different shift every day. And their job was to perform 2-person Broadway plays on a loop all day long at full performance intensity. Obviously, they didn't need to memorize it, and they didn't really need to walk or anything because, they had the scripts. Each day brought a different pair of actors, and each day a different play. 8 hours a day, nothing but the same play. I think we did the gin game, we did there were a lot of plays. A Mammoth play. We also, of course, did Night Mother, which was currently on Broadway, which gave the piece its title. A couple of twists in that sculpture. The actors were seated on either end of that L, so they could hear each other, but they couldn't see each other. And at the last minute, I thought it would be nice to either relieve or exacerbate the situation by adding a mirror, so they could at least catch each other in there. At the last minute, I also shoved the entire structure over towards the walls a little bit. So just as the actors couldn't see each other, the audience couldn't see the actors. They could only hear these plays being done, but they couldn't see what kind of acting was actually happening inside, whether they were being incredibly passionate or eating lunch. A lot of the time they were doing both. But then at the last minute, I shoved the piece over to the walls and added benches so that it actually was much too close. And if you actually settled in to listen or to try to absorb the plays, the experience wound up being much more claustrophobic than meditative, because you could really feel the wall pressing in on you visually and physically. So the mirror, the monotony, the perceptual deprivations, the consciousness splitting, these were all Nauman tricks. These were all things that I must have picked up off of those two pieces. But I think that certain premises entail one another. You can't emulate one person's productivity, for instance, without emulating their Adderall addiction. And you can't emulate someone's amazing spontaneity without possibly entailing their fucked up family life. And I think maybe you can't actually adopt Nauman's formal premises in your first proper artwork without entailing a certain fatality of worldview that stays with you even once you think you've gotten over it. At some point, when I was trying to persuade an actor to perform in this box, he asked me, was there a curtain call? And I was like, of course there's no curtain call, they can't see you. And he asked me, rightly, well, why would I want to perform if there was no applause? And that's when I realized that I'd basically remade another work of Nauman's that I didn't even know about, only using actors.
And repeat, we're sitting on a fence. Pete fell off. Who was left? Repeat. Oh. Pete and repeat, we're sitting on a fence. Pete fell off. Who was left? Repeat. Oh. Oh.
This is from Clown Torture, which is a multi-channel video installation. It goes on a really long time. There's other clowns in similarly constrained situations.
Pete and repeat, we're sitting on a fence. Pete fell off. Who was left? Repeat. Pete.
So, that was maybe a little bit of a prelude. I thought that piece was the kind of Nauman-y piece, and then I thought I'd moved on, but working on this I realized maybe I actually didn't. My work, as Manuel said, pretty much comes from theater and uses certain elements of theater to examine ideas about work, ideas about labor, ideas about consciousness, ideas about sentience. Pretty different from the kind of really rugged, stark, pretty existential slant of Nauman's, which very rarely, with a couple of exceptions, gets bogged down in historical specifics. And therefore, when people talk about Nauman in terms of performance, or they usually talk about him in terms of Judson or Yvonne Rainer or Meredith Monk, or fairly formalistic kind of work. And when they talk about Nauman in terms of theater, they generally talk about him in terms of Beckett or something similarly existential. This is partially because these are the influences he owns up to. But that's not really the kind of theater I ever enjoyed. My concerns tend to be a lot more worldly and a lot more commercial. But there's a lot to explore in Nauman from that point of view as well. So I'm gonna, because all the same questions about monotony, about exploitation, about power, apply whether they're abstract or concrete. So for a change, I'm gonna try to read Nauman in terms of a more commercial kind of performance and a more commercial kind of spectatorship. And then try to figure out where the performance and the spectatorship kind of meet. So this talk's going to be structured in about 3 sections. The first of which is actors, the second which is spectators, the third of which is how they connect, and the fourth is the fateful coda. Let's start with actors. This is a headshot of Joan Lancaster. I'm sorry about the shitty reproduction, I found it on eBay. Joan Lancaster was a roughly C-list TV and film actor. She was in a 1975 episode of Policewoman, and then the 1979 made-for-TV movie Transplant, as well as a really, really raunchy 1979 kind of mix of social conscience and blaxploitation film called Good Luck, Mrs. Wyckoff. She was always a background actor. But in 1979, she picked up a 2-season, occasionally recurring role on Dallas, if any of you remember this soap opera, as one Linda Bradley. Linda Bradley always appeared alongside Marilee Stone as emissaries from the Texan high society organization known as the Daughters of the Alamo. And they functioned as a kind of bitchy chorus. And I'm going to give you a little taste of Joan Lancaster's acting.
That was a wonderful talk, Mr. Martin. Moved us all deeply. And you can be sure that our organization is going to help you with your hospital project.
What Sue Ellen means is your research project.
Oh, that's exactly what I meant. Of course. How silly of me.
She's drunk.
Could I have a word with you, Miss Ellie?
And pregnant.
Certainly, Marilee.
Hi, ladies.
Hi, J.R.
How'd the meeting go?
Just fine, J.R.
Hey, darling. You all right?
I'm fine.
She's had a very hard day, J.R. These meetings take a lot out of her.
Maybe she shouldn't have so many meetings.
She and I have talked about it, and she's hoping that the ladies will let her resign.
Well, if you really want to, Sue Ellen.
Just till the baby's born, of course. And you're feeling yourself again.
Thank you very much.
I guess we'd better get going. Seth will be wondering what happened to me. Bye.
Between 1980 and 1985, she goes completely off the radar. And she only resurfaces briefly in 1985 doing this.
You pay, we pay. This is payment. I don't want to die. You don't want to die. We don't want to die. This is fear of death. I was a good boy. You were a good boy. We were good boys. That was good. I was a good girl. You were a good girl.
And
we
you can
were
see,
good girls.
again, her
That
sort of
was
laser-like
good.
focus, that mix
I
of
was a bad
skepticism and
boy.
intensity that she brought to all 12 of the lines she did on Dallas. But the TV she shows up on isn't in your home. The TV she shows up on
I was a good
is-
boy. You were a good boy. We were good
We were
boys.
good boys.
That was good.
That was good.
I was a good...
I'll just play it here. Since I have 2 screens, I may as well use them. What she shows up in is a 2-channel video installation by Nauman called Good Boy, Bad Boy, where he employs 2 actors, one from TV, the other one from theater, to...
I was a
I
good
was a
boy.
good boy.
You were
You
a good boy. We were good boys.
We were good boys.
That was good.
That was good.
I was a good girl. You were a good
I was a
girl.
good girl.
We were good
You
girls.
were a good girl.
That was
We
good.
were good girls.
I was a bad
was good.
boy. You were a bad boy.
I was a bad boy.
We were bad boys.
You were a bad boy.
That was bad.
We were bad boys.
I was a bad
That
girl.
was bad.
You were a bad girl.
Guess
I was
what?
a
It
bad
goes
girl.
on for a really
Bad
long
girl.
time.
Bad girl.
That was
We were
bad.
bad girls.
They actually have 100 phrases that they decline. Sorry, not decline, but conjugate. Beginning with, I was a good boy, you were a good boy, we were good boys, that was good, and going all the way to, in the last set, I don't want to die, you don't want to die, we don't want to die. This is fear of death. They each do this loop 5 times, becoming more and more dramatic as they go. This is close to the last loop. And the camera inches
I
along.
like to shit. You like to shit. We like to shit. This is shitting. I piss. You piss. We piss. This is piss. I like to sleep. You like to sleep. We like to sleep. This is sleeping. I pay. You pay. We pay. This is payment. I don't want to die. You don't want to die. We don't want to die. This is fear of death. I was a good boy.
The camera inches up incrementally closer on each of the first 4 takes and then recedes on the 5th. The performances were shot separately, and they're meant to be looped. They're meant to be played looping on separate monitors so that eventually they go out of phase and the phrases just cease to match up, and that's when it really starts to feel like they're talking to each other. Nauman pointed out in this interview that since Tucker Smallwood came from theater and Lancaster from TV, they had very different acting styles, the theater actor being more broad and dramatic, the TV actress being more tight and controlled, as you're supposed to go smaller when you're not on stage. What's interesting here is why Nauman chose to hire professional actors. Like, why couldn't it be friends? What is it about actors? He gave a sort of typically Nauman-y answer. And actually reading interviews, you realize, you read enough interviews with Nauman, and you realize he's like the thinking person's Jeff Koons in terms of like how he responds to things, because there's always this crazy blankness where it's just like, yep, kinda, yeah. And the answers are, on the surface, more complex and obviously less positive, but they also, like pretty much every piece of Nauman's, reading these interviews just gives you a sense of massive emotional vacuum, no matter what, but it's also completely compelling. So, he says that he wanted this strange surface quality that actors bring, which is pretty much the same thing he said about the clowns and the same thing about the mimes, and it doesn't really bring you very much closer to understanding what it is about actors and why it had to be actors, although I can kind of sympathize. But the video partakes in at least one of Nauman's preoccupations, which is the possibility of language communicating anything. And it's a possibility that Nauman always explores by examining exhaustively an extensive set of severely limited grammatical permutations. In this case, you just say this phrase in conjugated 4 ways and then move on. You can see it in 100 Live or Die. You can see it in all kinds of pieces. In the neons that reduce everything to puns. In the clown torture, where you all you can say is Pete and repeat. Sad and offense. Pete fell off. Who's left? Repeat. Again and again. There's another clown that just says no over and over. But with the clowns and also with the actors, you have to wonder how they felt about it. Because that's really not what they're trained to do. They're trained to get involved, they're trained to give you their heart, they're trained to invest in a narrative, they're trained to invest in story. And I always wonder how conventional actors feel about performing in these art videos, because art videos pretty much pride themselves on their anti-mimetic and anti-emotional tendencies. In this case, I was lucky enough to find a note on Tucker Smallwood's blog, where he writes that he was wandering through a museum. He actually is recognized now for having played an alien on one of the Star Trek spin-offs, but he was wandering through a museum and somebody was like, "Hey, you're that guy from the Louvre." And he had no idea what they were talking about, and then he later found out he had no idea. So on his blog he wrote, "It was so abstract and amorphous, I had nothing to hold on to, and I promptly forgot all about it. In those days, I was doing 2 or 3 jobs a week, but primarily for products. And when I wrote to Mr. Smallwood to find out what his experience was like, he replied, 'Man, I didn't know it was an art video. I didn't know anything about its intentions that I remember. It was simply a paycheck.'" But what's really striking about this is, for all that the performance winds up being totally alien to what actors do in performance, it's actually almost utterly consistent with the way actors in the 80s were trained.
You have sandals on.
I have sandals on.
You have sandals on.
I have sandals on.
You have sandals on.
I know I have sandals on.
You know you have sandals on?
Yes, I know.
Yes, you know?
Yes, I know.
Yes, you know.
I know.
You know.
I know.
You know.
Yes.
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 And those guys are still beginners. They're still feeling too much. Once you get really good at it, you can do it like this.
Your shirt is tied.
My shirt is tied.
Your shirt is tied.
My shirt is tied.
Your shirt is
My
tied.
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 shirt is tied.
Your shirt is tied.
That is known as, guess what? The repetition exercise. And it was the inspiration of one Sanford Meisner, who along with Lee Strasberg and Stella Adler were responsible for making psychological realism the default approach to American acting. And from the 50s on, for proponents of method acting and the Meisner technique and the Adler school poured out of New York and onto stages, studios, and film lots all over America. Brando, De Niro, Duvall, pretty much anyone you can think of came from there. All three of these approaches were descended from the system, so-called, of the great Russian actor, director, and teacher Konstantin Stanislavski, who realized early in his acting career, one night on stage, that he suddenly didn't feel authentic. And I can't convey to you enough what a bizarre notion that would be, because prior to the 20th century, acting is just a job. You put your costume on, you leave. There's no question of your actual self fusing with the character. Of course, you're not supposed to feel authentic. You're acting. Up until about 10 or 15 years ago, you could still find theaters in England where there would be a bar backstage, and you would see actors in Shakespeare plays in costume kind of showing up, having a pint between acts when they weren't in and then going back out because it's just a costume. But Stanislavski has this weird sense that he needs to feel truer when he's acting. And in Stanislavski's hands, acting becomes not a job, but a calling, a vocation. To use a phrase that every subsequent acting teacher would lay claim to, acting suddenly became, and I'm quoting here, the art of living truthfully under imaginary circumstances. And no one in theater ever really stopped to question the paradox, which is, why should you feel real when you're faking it? Instead, Stanislavski and his American descendants set about devising a set of techniques to block out the distractions of audience and theater and self-consciousness so that you could experience the onstage reality as your reality, so that you could truly be in the moment. And thus, we get terms and techniques like the fourth wall, the imaginary wall you've all heard of between yourself and the audience so that you can pretend you're not being seen, or being in character, for which you need 20 minutes of meditation to really feel what's going on. And all of these concepts are designed to bring you as close as possible to feeling as though you're authentically alive when you're on stage, a fusion of yourself and the character you're inhabiting. The sensation is experienced by both actor and audience as an electric kind of presentness radiating from the stage. And I would say that all of you have, at some point felt that kind of electricity if you ever go see plays. You feel it maybe at least once in your life. So Strasberg's method acting tries to achieve this presentness by vividly re-experiencing sensations from the actor's own past life when on stage. And Adler advocates achieving this presentness through a fully researched and imagined experience of the character's circumstances. And Meisner, as you've seen, claims presentness on stage is achieved by pure and immediate gut response rather than any kind of internality. But what is common to all of these approaches, and what starts bringing us closer to Nauman again, is a profound distaste for reflection or critical awareness of any kind, or as Meisner says, because it just gets in the way of immediacy. So the repetition exercise is just a means to inculcate responsiveness by using conjugation to empty language of its sense, so it just becomes a pure case of reflecting affect back at each other because the phrase can automatically be stated. Or again, as Meisner says, Now, this evacuation of meaning through repetition can go one of two ways. It can either liberate a whole universe of affect, as acting teachers claim, or it can lead to this.
Pete and repeat were sitting on a fence and Pete fell off. Who was left? Repeat. Oh. Pete and repeat were sitting on a fence. Pete fell off. Who was left? Repeat. Pete and repeat were sitting on a fence. Pete fell off.
The evacuation of affect, performance as work, work as a prison. Your only latitude.
Pete and repeat were sitting on a fence and Pete fell off. Who was left? Repeat.
And once you're in a situation like that, your only latitude is desperate and frustrated attempts to make things interesting. Now, of course, one of them is rehearsal and the other one's performance. One of them is backstage, the other one's on stage. One of them is inside, the other one's outside. And these are polarities that Nauman plays with forever. I tend to side with Nauman on this one. It's a pretty bleak life. But the problem is, and you can even see it in Walter Stevens' The Clown, is the drama of people trying to inhabit this subjectivity, right? These actors are really putting everything they have into it, but from the outside it just looks like boring old repetition. I tried to have it both ways in a project I did in 2007 called Barren Theatre, where I hired an American method actor who knew no German to learn the role of a farmer in a 1950s play about German socialist farmers. We had it translated. He learned the role. We staged it. And then as soon as it was staged, we never performed it. Instead, we shipped him out to a little land art center in Brandenburg, where the play is set, and gave him 2 acres of land and a ton of potatoes and asked him to be in character every day for 5 days a week for a month, which entailed just actually farming for 10 hours a day. He never said the lines. He never did anything. He just had to farm as somebody else. So he could take breaks but he could only take breaks in character, right? So when he could stop farming, but he could never stop acting. When he was sitting in his hut, he would have to try to think the character's thoughts. And of course, you had to take it on faith that this guy was acting. There was no external proof. Like I said, I tried to split the difference, but it was still pretty bleak. Who wants to catch Sam up in 1 minute or less on the plot of this play?
This should be good. I want Barlow to do it.
A town in Germany after the Russians have
That's us in rehearsal.
Eastern Germany, and this is just in the late 40s, early 50s, right when the German Democratic Republic, which is really just the communist East Germany, is forming its government. And in this really kind of unstable political environment, Flint, the character that I'm playing, is a communist idealist.
Yeah, rehearsal's nice. You get to talk a lot. You get to feel a lot. There's those repetitive tasks again. But yeah, like I said, I tried to split the difference, but it was still pretty bleak. Although the tourists who came to watch the guy doing manual labor with picnics seemed to enjoy it. But it turns out that the attempt to explore, as I was trying to explore, a consciousness that's kind of internally imprisoned with no outward sign of it, right? I mean, there's no way to know that he's really farming. There's no way to know that he's really acting. He could just be doing the work. It turned out that also had already been entailed years earlier by the way Nauman looked at things. These are stills from Nauman's 1973 videotapes, Tony sinking into the floor face up and face down, and Elke allowing the floor to rise over her face up. I'm going to try to... let you see a little bit of that as I discuss it. Thank you also to EAI for supplying me with all of these projection copies. Yeah, so these pieces are based on exercises Nauman devised in his own studio in those same years as 68 and 69, and which he wrote out as instructions in 74. I don't know if you can read the instructions, but they basically, well, he said the exercise is simply to lie there and convince yourself that you are sinking into the floor and do it for as long as possible. And for Elke, the exercise is to imagine the floor is rising over her. And Nauman was trying, he says, to, I'm quoting, examine a purely mental activity as opposed to a purely physical situation, which might incur some mental activity. Does that make sense? Examine a purely mental activity as opposed to a purely physical situation, which might incur some mental activity. What he basically wanted to know is what happened if your mind was somewhere totally different than your body. So he simply concentrated on trying to sink into the floor, or concentrated on having the floor rise up over him, and would practice this on the wooden floor of his studio, trying to do it for an hour at a time. But he claims he never made it past 15 to 20 minutes. In 1973, with the opportunity to use a TV studio in New York, Nauman decided it would be interesting maybe to watch other people do it, and then maybe other people would have better luck than just 15 or 20 minutes. And so he decided to use, guess what, actors. So this is the first time he shoots outside of his studio, in a professional TV studio. This is the first time Nauman shoots someone other than himself performing. And again, this thing about like actors, why would you need professional actors? Are they better at taking on someone else's agenda? Is it because they're more willing to follow orders? Is it because they're trained to inhabit a foreign subjectivity? Is it because they can make themselves believe things that others can't? What is exactly an actor? And why call someone an actor? And what do you do with it once you've called them an actor? What are they? Now, this is the 70s, and although Meisner technique, which you just saw, exists, it's not really the cultural force yet that it would turn into in the 80s. In the 70s, the dominant technique for actors is still the method, and the dominant technique of the method is something called affective memory, where you sink back into sensory memories from long ago to the point of actually re-experiencing the moments you're remembering. Here's a clip from 1975, I think, about a year or two after Tony and Elke lay down for Nauman. Here, Lee Strasberg is leading a student named Francesca Orzona through an affective memory exercise, which is returning her to childhood.
I'm little. I have a flat white shoe. A dress. I don't like being small. The curtain. The white curtain. I'm sitting at the white curtain in the window and it's round around the window. Cold. I'm cold. I'm cold. Black street, white sidewalks, ugly telephone poles, gray.
The whole thing is really 70s, like really self-indulgent, really kind of me, really kind of like regression-esque, gestalt therapy, trance, cult, whatever. Although it does seem to be working. It's kind of ridiculous, but it's also pretty effective. And sure enough, after about 20 minutes, Tony, the professional actor, had a weird choking fit as his molecules start to mingle with the cement floor.
Really terrifying.
I'm going to read Nauman's description of the event. I got pretty scared and didn't know what to do. I didn't know if I should wake him up or what, if he was kind of sleepwalking. I didn't know if he was physically ill or if he was really gasping and choking. He finally sat up and kind of controlled himself, and we talked about it. He was really scared. He said, I just tried to do it too fast, and I was afraid I couldn't get out. What had happened was that as his chest began to sink through the floor, it was filled up, and he just couldn't breathe anymore, so he started to choke. He said, I was afraid to move my hand because I thought if I moved it, some of the molecules would stay there and I would lose it. It would all come apart, and I couldn't get it out. Interestingly, the night before, the same thing had happened to the girl in the other tape, which is actually true. If you can sit through an hour of it, you will actually see Elka coughing and choking too. So once again, we're seeing specific psychological techniques being deployed in opposite directions. The actor's capacity to empty out their minds and believe anything leads either to the liberation of the self on Strasberg's stage, but it leads to the complete elimination of the self in Nauman's studio. Or, to put it another way, here's Strasberg's acting class.
The elimination of tension is valuable, of course, for every human being, not just for the actor. And it would be very important for people to realize that it's not just the emotional stress that they deal with, that we know when we get nervous about something and so on.
And here's Nauman's studio. Everybody!
Is essential to every human being, but for the actor, it is a necessity. Much better.
What I love is how...
I still feel tightness there, but much better. Look at that. Look at that. I can't open it. You see that? That's tension. Muscles here.
You're going to see a shirtless guy in the upper left corner in a second, the upper right corner for a second. Left.
Because everything from here goes immediately ready to be spoken. No, the fingers. The fingers, the toes, the shoulders.
I love watching all these impeccably coiffed LA actors regress.
No, you see? Yeah. You see? That's all that this is, darling. It's no reflection on your talent, which we know. It just shows that much as and wonderful as you may be, you have capacities now which do not coincide with what you're capable of doing. Too much of what you do may be mental.
So, obviously that evacuation of sense becomes a problem in terms of power relations either way, and there was a clip I lost of Strasberg just like screaming at a woman and making her cry for not following orders. But Strasberg was still a guru to these actors, leading them to liberation. Again, it's an inside-outside thing, because from the outside, it just looks like this.
Put your hand on your hat in your lap.
This is from Shit in Your
Drop
Hat.
your hat.
Where an offstage voice tells this mime to execute activities that she...
Put your head in your hand in your lap.
Very gamely tries to execute for a while.
Put your hand in your lap. Put your hat
Eventually he tells her to
hand
shit in her hat and put it on her head. She bimes it.
Put your head on your lap, on your hand in your lap.
Now she has MS. But that inside-outside problem is Nauman's... Oh, did I tell you that Joan Lancaster is now in a retirement home and you can purchase monogrammed items of hers on eBay? The inside-outside problem is Nauman's essential problem. Inside consciousness, inside a cage, outside a cage, inside your head, outside your head. So, in order to begin thinking about spectators, I want you to imagine that Tony was actually successful in sinking into the floor, and that Elke was actually successful in having the floor rise up over her. They've both vanished. So where does that leave us, spectators? It leaves us on display, with nothing to look at, which is what happens to spectators when they're watching and have nothing to look at. And Nauman is also the great kind of master of thinking through issues like that. I'll give you a more specific example. This is a piece of Nauman's at Western Washington University. This is not a piece of Nauman's. This is a few blocks from here. This is that dumb theater on the High Line. And it seems like a great idea when you're on the High Line until you actually sit on it. And then you start realizing there's actually nothing to see. You're just sitting there sort of watching theatrically. And you don't really get how nasty Diller and Scofidio can be until you actually walk west on that street and start looking at the people in the theater. And then you realize the whole point is to put them on display. This is a different space, not to put the street on display. It's basically just to make a spectacle of everybody watching. I have to give Nauman credit for starting to think about spectatorship as well, because a few months after I saw those pieces at the Deutsche Guggenheim, I wound up at DIA, and I discovered his indoor-outdoor seating arrangement, which isn't talked about very much. It's currently, I think, being slightly retired. It's basically a big set of bleachers, and you can arrange them any way you want, so long as they stretch from indoors to outdoors. And the way they were arranged at DIA, which is actually totally consistent with the Washington Stadium seating, is basically facing each other. And the total futility of having bleachers back to back facing in opposite directions, or placing bleachers together facing each other, the reduction of the bleachers to sculptural objects because there's nothing to see, there's nothing to spectate, makes you think about them as architectural cues and the ways in which certain kinds of institutional objects or institutional spaces cue very particular behavior. These things are designed to make you stand up and cheer. That is what this seating is made to do. Or to sit down, or to stand up, or to sit down, or to stand up, or to sit down, or to stand up, or to sit down, or to stand up. So this entire thinking about spectatorship and just what it was, and framing spectatorship in the absence of an actual object to look at, also kind of influenced a bunch of my work. And in 2012, I tried to make a piece about spectatorial behavior that was called Habit, where I wanted to see how theater would show up under gallery viewing conditions. So I commissioned a totally average play, and they're always set in a house, and they're always set in the same kind of house, which is trashed, and they're always the same characters, and I built the house, and I had the actors occupy it, and they had no staging, but since the house was totally functional, they could cook, they could eat, they could use the bathroom, they could do whatever they wanted. They just couldn't deviate from the dialogue of the play. They had to do the play over and over, but they could live as they pleased. And the admission policy was totally free, as at a gallery. So the question was, if you turned theater into a sculptural object, and if you didn't charge admission, and you got rid of the illusion of the unique event, and you got rid of everything that lets you know you're seeing theater, what would be left, and how would you watch, and how would spectators behave, and could you still follow a narrative, and could you still experience it as a narrative? But a lot of the interest, or at least half the interest, was on seeing what spectators would do. This is from the Mass Mocha installation of it. And just the sort of migration patterns as they ran around the house, because obviously if you're watching the living room, you can't see the woman with the gun in the bedroom, and if you're in the bedroom, you can't see someone snorting coke in the bathroom, so you keep having to run around the outside of the house and poking your head in through the windows. Now, it was intended to be a more generous version of Night Motherfucker and to get me away from this reputation for torturing actors and putting them in Nauman-y kind of bleak situations. So it's fully furnished, there's cable, we stock the fridge every day. They have an infinite range of options in terms of how they do these things. They've got a very strict workday. It's 8 hours. They're on actors' equity contracts. Everything is above board. It's the nobility of work. Nothing is there to make them feel futile. Yes, there is a little bit of weird dynamic interaction between spectators and performers. They are being observed. It is a little bit like a fishbowl, but no, it's not like the double steel cage piece of Nauman's, where you know, as soon as you go into the cage, you are both spectating the inside of the cage and on display. You are trapped. No, it is not meant to be like that. It is absolutely not meant to be like Violent Incident, where Nauman hired trained actors again to do 12 permutations of exactly the same scene, which involves stabbing, beating. Just because my piece involved realism, it doesn't mean it was this bleak. Just because I gave the actors latitude on how to do things and needed professionals, it does not mean that things were this dire. Absolutely not. Just because you could watch it an infinite number of ways doesn't mean it's a limited vision the way Nauman sees life and acting. It doesn't. And actually, the only really good proof I can offer of this, but again, it's a backstage, onstage thing, is this very crazy clip I found of Nauman rehearsing. And he's actually the sweetest guy on the planet, as opposed to Strasberg.
Very funny. So now we
You gotta stand up. Go ahead and stand up. Just do it any over. So now you can. Yeah. Got it.
They're laughing. With the stage combat.
No. Because you got to kick it.
Oh, right. The important part is
When you get goose, I think you leave the chair on the floor. Out of the way. Bitch.
Oh, now here's the.
Here you're going to have to.
Gave these guys the second one, which he's not going to use the gun.
Okay, so we got to work the action out so that you get neat and you bend over. You can also reach the table, so you're close to the knife. Okay. You're going to have to stab her, and then you.
He looks like the dad on Family Ties. Nauman is being totally helpful.
Or something. And then struggle over the knife so that she gets the knife with you. Maybe you get surprised. Oh shit. You get stuck and then you can both fall down. Okay. So that's what we do. We might have to turn the action around so that you get past the knife.
See, totally nice, but at the end of the day, unfortunately, the situation is still this. So, you had a bunch of performers, you had a bunch of spectators. The spectators are suddenly on display, but they don't exactly consider themselves performers. How do you bridge this? Okay, so let's stick with this idea that Tony actually did manage to sink into the floor. And let's leave the upper world behind. Where are Tony and Elka? Where would they have found themselves? I propose they would have found themselves in a space like this. Underground, unseeable, out of existence. This is Nauman's model for trench and four buried passages, and after he was done with corridors, he turned his attention to tunnels and trenches. And all of them, even though you might think they're sculptures, he referred to somewhat sinisterly as models for tunnels. Here's two concentric tunnels, skewed and non-communicating. The thing about these models for tunnels, or sculptures, that strikes one most immediately is that they're basically models for prisons. It's carceral space, obviously, because there's no egress. It's carceral space, obviously, because it's out of view. I mean, the insides of them are out of view. It's also clearly a space for punishment, because it's all hallway and no rooms. You have no choice but to keep walking around. It's not like you can rest comfortably because these structures tend to be triangular and have triangular walls. And as Nauman says of triangular spaces generally, they're really uncomfortable, I'm quoting. They're disconcerting kind of spaces. There's no comfortable place to stay inside them or outside them. And lastly, these spaces, in addition to not letting you sit or relax, they imply a perpetual movement by their very name, tunnel, which is only there to move through, and movement in perpetuity by their very shape, the fact that they loop. So that's what Tony and Elka got for their belief. They're now stuck in an underground tunnel, and they have no choice but to keep moving. They have to keep executing the demands of the space. They're prompted to keep moving. And what else do we call responding to such prompts except performing? This whole read isn't as fanciful as you might think. You're experiencing this when you squeeze through Nauman's corridors. And there's that transitional space again, corridors, tunnels. And you're experiencing it in a corridor that was actually designed to force Nauman to perform. You experience this weird kind of compelled performance in the green light corridor. You're experiencing this compelled performance in video corridors, in the unsettling triangular room, in the piece called Room with My Soul Left Out, Room That Does Not Care, which is actually a room composed entirely of corridors, in the terrifying double steel cage piece if you go in. And actually, the one time Nauman designs a space that isn't transitional, that's actually a straight up four-cornered room, it keeps screaming at you to get out. Get out of the room. Get out of my mind. Get out of the... Guess how long this goes on for. Get out of my mind. Get out. Okay. But I'm going to say that the really disorienting thing about the video corridors, I don't know, do you guys know these pieces? Mostly, they're basically, if you don't know them, they're corridors that have monitors at the end, and the monitors are attached to surveillance cameras, but the monitors aren't attached to the surveillance cameras that you think they're attached to. So basically, as you approach the monitor, which you expect to be mirroring you, you're actually watching your own back, right? And this is the classic permutation. You're actually watching yourself going away, and that monitor is actually stacked on top of another monitor of exactly the same hallway, but there's no one in it, although you should be in it, but that one's not coming off a feed. It's really, really disorienting seeing your body in parts that way and your head cut off, but but the feedback loop of seeing your back, that's not the really disorienting thing. It's actually the fact that you're performing for no one but yourself. Those monitors properly belong in surveillance rooms of whatever lab technician or security guard is watching you, but no one's watching. Nobody cares. Somebody cared enough to install the cameras, but now no one cares. You're just performing for no one in an infinite loop. You are both performer and spectator. Okay, so a couple years ago, I got very interested in this idea of performer and spectator at the same time, and in the idea of infiltrators and plants. And so I designed a project where I had actors spend 3 months with volunteers acquiring their subjectivity. So they would meet 3 times a week, and the idea was to basically rasterize the volunteer, break him down according to the actor's training of what drives a character, and then rebuild them in their own body. And the actors were paired on the basis of schedule only, which was to ensure that there wouldn't be any rough caricature or mimicry going on, that it would really be about acquiring an inner subjectivity. And also that's where things get fun, because that's when you can start to pass. So Lelena can secretly experience the world as Bruce, and no one will be the wiser. And Kristen can secretly experience the world as me, which means I can pass as a black woman, theoretically. Lelena can pass and Lelena, who is 19, can pass as a 40-year-old man, and so on, and so on, and so on. It was an experiment. I wanted to see just how far these limits on subjectivity could go. Of course, to actually become somebody else, you need to evacuate yourself, even if you leave your body, even if it doesn't sink into the floor. And once again, in preparing this talk, I am slightly depressed to know that my celebration of actorly virtuosity has been pretty much totally preempted by Nauman's own treatment of empty heads. So these casts, and there's many, 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 many of them, are from friends of his. Some of them are performers, some of them are poets. I think one of these is Rindi Eckert's head. Rindi Eckert is an opera singer. Nauman makes very selective use of when he's working with professional performers. And the thing about these heads, if you haven't, have you ever seen them? He doesn't, I am, as you may have guessed, no kind of sculptor, but he basically doesn't really clean out the mold. So the plugs you wear in your nose when you're having your face cast, the little breathing tube you wear in your mouth, these actually leave traces when they're cast, and you basically sand them off, but not Nauman. He leaves them all in. So that's not a tongue, that's just a bite plate that someone was wearing so they could breathe. But the nose plug from someone's nose is currently going into somebody else's nose. So these aren't finished heads. These are rough casts for heads. They're things that are in rehearsal, that are made to perform. And the way those casts always look, the way you look when you're actually keeping your eyes shut and trying to have this stuff poured all over you, is always inevitably like you're trying to say something, but the only sound you're actually getting out Thank you.